Welcome to the Tea Room at the Socialite Crime Club, where conversation is mostly normal. It's all the chit-chat we don't chatter about in the criminal episodes, because cream and sugar are best served on the side. Here are your hosts, Keri and Ray.
We're excited to bring you Socialite Tea Time, where you get to know a little bit more about Cy and I from a professional perspective and a personal perspective. Today's tea time, we are really having tea, but because we live in Arizona, it's the end of October and it's still 100 degrees outside, we are drinking iced tea. And every time we have tea, I'll let you know what kind of tea we're drinking. Today is called Butterfly Garden. It's an oolong tea and it's low caffeine, but it's actually from a company that I really love called the Old Barrel Tea Company, in case any of you ever want to try this. It's based in Flagstaff, Arizona. My daughter introduced it to me when she was attending NAU, but I just wanted to promote them a little bit because I really love them so much. But let's get into a little bit about...
My tea?
Yeah, let's spill Cy's tea a little bit here. So
my tea is a wonderful blend of gin, vermouth, and just a little bit of olive brine, which we also like to call a dirty martini.
That's not what I meant. Let's spill your tea as in...
Oh.
Let's spill your tea as in what made you decide to become a law enforcement officer?
Man, it wasn't intentional. I can say that. I was really young. I was 20 going on 21. I was married. My oldest daughter had just been born. I was a struggling entrepreneur at the time. I was running and owned a seamless gutter and metal roof business, which I actually made pretty good money, but there wasn't anything satisfying. I had no idea what I wanted to be in life. Through a friend of my brother's, I was introduced to an officer at the local police department there who invited me to do a ride-along. And I did one ride along and I thought, man, this is really cool. And then I did 3 or 4, and then pretty soon I was doing them every week, every other week, and I just got hooked.
You were spending more time doing ride-alongs than you did actually running your business? Is that what you're saying?
I wouldn't say I got quite there, but it was getting close, where I realized this is what I want to do. So I wanted a job, but they weren't hiring. They offered me a reserve position. And with the reserve position, it's basically your obligation to get through the academy. Now, most of the people that I knew that were doing this were doing the nighttime college academy, which takes like a year and a half. But I just wanted to get it done. So I ran the numbers and I figured out that if I sold my business, I could support myself and my family for about 9 months. So I sold my business and I went to the academy. I had to pay my own way. It was a 16-week academy, but then there's a couple weeks leading up and a couple weeks after. So it ends up being about 5 months. And I paid my bills through the sale of my business, and I went and did the academy myself. When I was getting to the end of the academy, I still didn't have a job, and I was running out of money. So I was looking for a job, and I went to an interview with a smaller department, and it's a little bit awkward because the chief at the smaller department knew the chief of the department I was reserve at, and he says, "Well, if you're good enough for him, you're good enough for me. You're hired." And that's where my
friend of a friend type of thing?
Yeah, and that's where my law enforcement career began. I was at that smaller department for about 3 years, and then I moved to a much larger police department for the rest of my career. How about you?
So, I feel like my story isn't as glamorous as yours.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of glamour in putting yourself through the academy. Let me tell you, it was awesome.
So, my story started within law enforcement when I was pretty young, actually. I remember having conversations around the dining table with my parents about college and what I would be studying. And I remember one conversation, my dad said, "Well, you should go into criminal justice because you'll always have a job."
Sound advice.
Sound advice, and which is true. I would always have a job. I could pretty much do anything within the field that I wanted to, but pickings sometimes get slim when you realize what the pay is like and what you're actually doing.
My starting pay as a cop was $10.17 an hour.
Right. Yeah, so sometimes I wonder when my parents just didn't encourage me to do better in math and become like a surgeon or something, right? So anyway, I go through my high school years and I have this idea about oh, I think I'd like to be an FBI agent or some federal, like glamorous
position,
job,
yeah.
right? So I go to college, I get my degree in criminal justice, minor in English, and then I get into the corporate world after college, and I stayed in the corporate world for a couple of years until I decided that I got tired of my drive to work because I had to get on a freeway to go to work every day. My drive was at least 35 to 45 minutes to work one way. And then I decided I don't want to get on a freeway to go to work anymore. So I wanted a job close to home. I wanted a job that I had great benefits still. So I decided to apply to be a police officer in the community that I worked. And I got the job.
I don't remember it being quite like that.
What do you mean?
When you applied to be a police officer, was that the first time you applied for a city job that would allow you not to get on the freeway?
No, it wasn't.
What was the first job you applied for?
Okay, so the first time I applied at the police department, I was trying to get a job to be a crime prevention specialist.
And what does a crime prevention specialist do?
They basically support the community through offering different programs and trainings about protecting your home or your business from crime. So they show little gadgets you can use on your windows. They go to schools and talk about, like, you know, how not to be kidnapped, not.
But they're
to
part of
drugs.
the police department.
They're part of the police department.
Would you
yes.
say they were kind of like a support unit of?
They are. They're a support unit of the primary police department positions.
Apparently, at least, I can't say you weren't qualified, but you weren't the best qualified candidate for that job.
Apparently not.
And then you became a police officer. That was the next job you applied for was?
No, the next job I applied for was to be a dispatcher, which I did not get because I couldn't 10 keys. So of all of the test taking and everybody that had all of these great skills to be a dispatcher, I didn't know how to use the numerical part of the keyboard without like looking at it. So I didn't get that job.
So just to recap, crime prevention, dispatch, but we think you'd make a hell of a cop.
Yeah, so they gave me a gun and a bulletproof vest, and they're like, get out there, right? So.
Well, hang on though. I don't want to diminish that process either, because I don't think a lot of people listening may realize this. At the time, our department was actually a pretty desirable agency to work for. I can remember for about a 3 to 4 year period, we were having hundreds of candidates show up. I think one test we had like 600. And if I remember right, there was like 200 in your test to actually for like 1 or 2 police jobs.
Maybe a little less. So yeah, there was a couple of positions open, and I think about, I don't know, maybe 100 people showed up for the physical portion of the test. And then once you pass the physical, then you can, I think it's the written or vice versa, I don't remember. But anyway, it was dwindled down from about 100 people to finally getting to our agency's pre-academy after you passed your psych exam and your lie detector test and the physical and everything. And when it came down to the pre-academy, there was 2 of us. So during pre-academy, the other guy gets weeded out. And it's just me that ends up going to the academy to become a police officer.
But like out of 180 people.
Yeah,
which
it
to
might
me
have
is
been less.
hilarious.
I don't
Like,
remember exactly.
They pass you over on the other 2 positions, which they're probably hiring a lot less. The candidate pools are
Right.
much less. But like, I'm going to say it. Some dispatchers may get upset with me later on, but I'm going to say it because there's so many different disciplines. The hardest of the 3 jobs, they're like, oh, this girl's a shoo-in.
Basically, yeah. It was the one that I least wanted, actually, which later has truly been a blessing in disguise that I would have never expected.
There's some divine intervention.
There was
leading you to
divine
where you had to
intervention
go there.
happening here, yeah. So I'm really excited, though, for people to hear about what you've done in your role and career as a law enforcement officer.
Yeah, so that's the great thing about law enforcement is there's such a wide gamut of the different specialties you can kind of get into. So like any patrol officer, I started in patrol. That's where I kind of learned the ropes, if you will, of being a cop. I did that for about 3 years, and I ended up in a DEA task force So I was still a state sworn police officer in Arizona, but I was assigned to the DEA. And it was an undercover position, and we were targeting narcotics, mainly methamphetamine. Methamphetamine labs were a really big deal at that time. I got to work with a lot of phone records within that investigation. It really opened my eyes to the power of being able to interpret phone records. So that was kind of my first taste of that investigative piece. I did that for about a year, had a really fun, really cool case that it'll be its own episode at one point. Got out of that and went straight into our investigative unit. So I was assigned to persons crimes. So we would work any crime against a person, whether that's a sexual assault, it could be a child molest, it could be a violent crime like an armed robbery or homicide. I spent a lot of time doing those investigations. That was the majority of my career. At the same time, I was also a member of our SWAT team, so I got to do a lot of fun types of training and different types of deployment in more of a tactical setting. But I kept coming back to a handful of core disciplines, I think, for me throughout my career. Interviewing was always something I was just fascinated with. The ability to sit down with somebody who just committed a really heinous crime and figure out a way to associate, understand, and get them relaxed enough to talk about this crime was always just something I was fascinated with. So I spent a lot of time trying to perfect my interviewing techniques. And a lot of people call it an interrogation. My experience is being a hard ass in an interview never works. And if it does, it's a rare thing. Interviewing is really finessing and befriending, if you will, and actually trying to get somebody to understand that you understand what they're coming from.
Do you think we'll ever have a technical talk on interviewing?
We absolutely will have a couple. We have an episode that I think is definitely going to require it, where the interview is really called into question later on, and it's a very interesting episode. Also with crime scenes, like I was really into the art of gathering evidence for forensic purposes. So I spent a lot of my own time, money, and effort training myself, going to training, paying for training, in blood spatter, for example. So the ability to interpret blood stains and blood patterns at a crime scene. In fact, Hammerside, episodes 4 and 5, will get into that big time. Trajectory and ballistic recreation, the ability to understand the path a bullet might take and why it does really weird things in flight. And we've got some interesting stories that we will definitely hit on that. And then obviously coming back to cell phones. That was kind of my forte. I was really, really good at understanding how people used phones in their day-to-day life and how if I could look at those records, I could see these little changes. And typically those little changes open doors to, well, we need to look at this a little closer. And the second piece of phone records is geolocation, and that's the ability to actually see where a phone has been or where it may be going. And we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. But I really got the opportunity to work a number of roles. I was a supervisor for a while. I even took a leave of absence for 6 months and went over to Afghanistan to become an undercover mentor to the Afghan police team, targeting IED cells, very similar as we target cartels. So just this crazy wide range of experience at this point going through my career.
How long did your career span? Can you let them know?
I was just shy of 20 years. So when I left law enforcement, I was less than a year away from being 20 years. It's a long time.
That's a long career. Well, actually, your career didn't even end then, which we'll get into.
Oh, I was just getting warmed up.
You were.
How about you?
So most of my time was spent in the role of patrol. Actually, I had a few weeks here and there playing in investigations, but I spent a lot of my career, because I was a young officer, our department was not hiring for a very long time. I spent a lot of my career on graveyards. So by the time I actually did move around between, because you were placed where you were in your level of seniority within the agency. So because we didn't hire for a long time, I didn't get off graves and actually go to somewhat shifts where I could maintain my sanity for a while, at least a few years. During that time, though, I realized I was just a shit magnet, if you will, for domestic violence calls. And the more domestic violence calls I went on, I realized how complex they were. Our agency at the time did not have a DV unit. And to be quite frank, I didn't even realize that DV units existed in other agencies until I went to training for domestic violence cases because I was getting them so often. So I paid for my own training. I went to this domestic violence, a huge workshop, which was amazing. I met amazing people there, and ultimately started actually, without realizing it, creating an expert out of myself in DV cases, because I found myself going and testifying even when I wasn't on the clock in DV cases that I had worked or that somebody had asked me about. So ultimately, I ended up developing the foundation for our agency's first domestic violence unit. But in the meantime, I was also trying to prepare to go into investigations. So I paid for my own training for homicide school. I went to blood spatter school. I did autopsies. I went and attended autopsies with some really, really good medical examiners. Well, a good medical examiner who really took the time to show me different things about the body, the story that it tells once they can flay it open. And you can actually see all of the intricacies that you would never know.
The mechanism of an injury.
Yes, and it was just amazing. So it was great training. But I was able to leave law enforcement before I ever got the chance to use all those new amazing skills to start a company with my amazing husband, Cy.
Yeah, but let's back up there just a little bit. I want to dive into two things that you brought up. Number one, in law enforcement, if you really want to go do something, there is the ability to go out there and create kind of this expertise, if you will, and really dive into it. Law enforcement is just wide open, full of opportunities. If you have the drive and the motivation to do it yourself, there's a lot of places you can go in within law enforcement. The second thing is we have to talk about domestic violence a little bit. When most people hear domestic violence, they think the run-of-the-mill, it's abusive relationship, husband's beating up the wife, something of that nature. And it was really, really interesting watching and listening to you go through some of what you just described through the DV training. At that point, one of the cases that I worked early in my career, it was this crazy homicide where husband killed wife. We'll do plenty of stuff on it, and everybody else has too. It's been on 48 Hours, Dateline, 2020, Oxygen, Discovery. It's been around for 20 years, and I still get calls.
All the time. It's crazy.
I got a call last week on another production that wants to do it. But it wasn't until we solved the case, convicted the suspect, and we're talking 7 or 8 years after the homicide, you and I are talking, and you're like, well, that's domestic violence. And I'm like, well, of course the homicide's domestic violence. You're like, no. And what I didn't catch is prior to him killing his wife, he never abused her physically. It was all coercive control. And it's this manipulation that went on for a really long time where he controlled the relationship and literally drove her in a certain direction so that he could set this homicide up for what looked like a suicide potentially. And it was all through coercive control. And I just remember thinking so profoundly when you explained that to me that one time, here I am, a very accomplished homicide detective, and you were schooling me on DV stuff that I never knew before. So that's something I want to make sure that we really keep true as we have these little tea time talks, and when we do obviously the episodes, that we give our listeners a little bit of background, that there's more to it than what they typically hear. But to follow up with what you were saying, yeah, I started teaching cell phone investigations, if you will, about 2007, 2008. So I was still a police officer at the time, but I had this side job, if you will. I started my own training company, and I was teaching all over the country. Probably 2012.
Can we say what the name of that company was?
It was Phoenix Training Council. No longer exists, but at the time it was Phoenix Training Council.
I think the Facebook page is still up.
It might be. It wouldn't surprise me. In 2012, 2013, somewhere in that time frame, I can't remember the specific date, I was teaching a class in Salt Lake City, Utah. And it was a week-long class. And at the end of the class, the detective, or a detective that was in the class, came up and she said, hey, do you have just a minute that you can look at some phone records on this case? And she explained it was an unsolved homicide involving a 15-year-old girl who was brutally, brutally murdered. And she hands me the set of phone records, and there's like 35,000 calls. They had an entire year worth of phone records. I didn't know the date of the crime at the time. So I'm just very quickly looking, kind of just thumbing through these pages, 35,000 calls. And I stopped on one in particular, and I saw something, and it's too technical to get into right now. We'll do a whole episode on this. This is the little Annie case. But I saw this little snippet, and I'm thinking, I've never seen this before. This is a big deal. And kind of forgetting about her case for a second, I'm like, hey, have you noticed this? Because to me, I was kind of nerding out a little bit. And she's like, no, but why are you pointing at that call? And I said, well, this is a big deal. Like, this doesn't hardly ever happen. She's like, that's the time of the homicide. So in looking at a set of records, 12 months, 35,000 calls in a matter of 5 minutes, I was able to pinpoint a phone call at the time of the murder.
Well, and it's one of those things that sends chills down your spine when you can actually identify and fact find something that you knew nothing about prior.
I'll tell you, that moment changed my life. I remember driving home from Salt Lake City thinking, it shouldn't be this hard. She had those records for years, or at least a year. They've been sitting in a drawer because nobody knew what to make out of them.
Because didn't she just catch the case because it was a cold case? Like she was
the second investigator assigned to it. The first investigator was actually killed in the line of duty. So they lost a ton of his work. And it was just kind of a mess. And I just remember thinking, there's got to be a way for law enforcement to take this very technical call detail record data and put it into a program, and it just shows them the obvious things that they need to see. So I did a bunch of research, and I was doing a lot of phone cases at the time, and so I knew the products out there, and I just wasn't really happy that any of those products were delivering. I thought, you know what, I'm going to make my own. I was not a computer nerd. I do not have any background in programming or coding or any of that. So I started doing research. I read a lot of books on coding. I did a lot of YouTube. You can learn anything on YouTube these days. And I taught myself some very basic programming skills. And I knew what I was getting from the phone company, and I knew the output that was showing investigators how to solve these cases. I just had to figure out how to take A and make B, programmatically. And eventually, over about a year and a half, I was able to figure that out. So I now had a program. So other agencies, I'm helping agencies all over the country at this point, but other agencies would send me their records, or they would ask for my help, and I would create this mapping tool and give it back to them, and they were just, oh my God, how do I get this? I'm like, yeah, no, it's just something I made. Well, can you give me a copy? No, I'm not going to give you a copy.
I think what's important for people to understand is that when you are a detective or a police officer looking at call detail records, it is a mass amount of data. If you think about how often you actually use your own phone, how many times you look at your phone throughout the day, or send a text message, or receive a text message, or just pick up your phone to look at the time, there is a piece of data for every time you use your phone throughout the day. And when we're talking about people using their phones throughout over the course of a week or a month, and you're a detective who's looking at this data, it is extremely complex. So I just wanted to make that point because I don't know that our viewers and listeners would understand that.
Yeah, it's never as easy as you think it would be. And once you figure out something with Verizon, then you got to deal with AT&T. And it's totally different, or T-Mobile.
They're all different,
yeah.
Because they all have their own proprietary thing going on.
Right. So yeah, I realized, and at that point I saw the vision, and I think I loved law enforcement and the teaching side of it because of the ability to make a difference. Like, I knew I was impacting cases. I was solving cases that otherwise probably would have gone unsolved. And the big driving force behind this next jump was I'm still kind of playing in this pond, and I'm doing a lot of really cool things in this small pond. Can I take these concepts that I've developed in this program that I built in the training program, and can we deliver it to the masses? Can we go jump in the ocean and make a difference there? And I think I bought a nice bottle of wine, and I kind of wine and dined you one night and told you, hey, if I do this, I need you to go with me, because I knew I wasn't capable of doing it on my own. And when you and I sit down and start planning things, like, that's where the magic happens. So, and we weren't married. We were just dating at this point.
Yeah, and I really, to be honest, like, I know I trusted you. I was like, yeah, I totally believe in anything that you're doing, because you were a super competent and great investigator. But I think maybe you roofied me because I really don't remember you asking me anything or even telling me. But at some point, I realized I agreed to cash out my retirement with him and go start a company that I have no idea is going to work or not. But I had a good feeling about it.
I don't think I roofied you. But the statute of limitations has passed.
Yes, the
anyway.
statute of limitations.
So I think we're okay on that. But yeah, I knew that in order for me to do it, I needed a really good partner. And you and I were far enough along in our dating at that point that you were the one. And this is kind of funny. We did this business for a number of years and we still weren't married. Like when we told people, hey, we're more committed than the average couple, we were
Very
the
committed.
owners of this company still dating, and we spent all of our time together. Like we literally built it from the ground up. But it was a great experience. We built this concept on a napkin over a bottle of wine into a multi-million-dollar, extremely successful, disruptive company that changed the way that a lot of this stuff is done, but more importantly, changed the way that it was being presented in court. We took our training program and our product and we figured out how to explain to any juror in a way that we could make sense, here's what's happening with the phone, and this is why it's important.
Well, I think it was also during a critical time in the courtroom, so to speak, simply because this type of data and technology was becoming more consistently challenged in the courtroom. And we were able to create and teach a way to the masses of law enforcement of how to ensure this type of data was accepted in a courtroom and admissible in a courtroom at a time when it was actually going downhill for this type of data.
Yeah, it was just a really fun ride to build that with you to the size of what it became. We had a little over 600 law enforcement customers. The training program is still going. In fact, the training program has blown up. It's its own $1 million entity at this point. I think we've taught probably 25 to 30,000 police officers throughout the world too, not just in the United States.
Right. Well, and the thing is, it's not just teaching police officers and law enforcement on how to use the product, but it's literally the investigative process of investigating call detail records. And I think it goes beyond that because oftentimes while we're working a case or looking at a set of records, it's not just the details of the data that we're looking at, but we start looking at other details of corroborative evidence within a case that we can start identifying that will help support the records in court.
So why is this important? Obviously, we have a background that is pretty unique. Where we were able to do the law enforcement investigative side, and then we started a law enforcement specific company that actually developed the product and the expertise. We've both testified in court as experts before, so we have that experience. But the thing that really opened the door for us is when we started the company, which was ZETX, by the way, ZETX. When we started ZETX, the calls for assistance blew up. It wasn't uncommon for us to receive 4, 5, 6, 7 calls a week from different agencies needing help.
All hours of the day and night, by the way.
We were 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. When major incidents happened around the country, it wasn't uncommon for us to get a call from, you name the agency, for assistance in helping. And we're going to talk about a lot of those calls. We have a lot of cases that were nationally known. But where that put us in a really unique place is we have the experience from the law enforcement side, we have the experience from the business side, but then we got the reps. We were working cases nonstop.
Well, we had so many cases we had to hire people to help us work cases and to continue our training classes. So we had built this really strong, amazing company, and it was noticed.
It was noticed. We were making some business partners with other bigger companies because we were trying to build new products and we needed to team up with some other companies. And a very large company came to us that we were doing this with and said, have you guys considered being acquired? And my first response was no, I don't want to sell this company. Like, I know where we're going, I know what we're doing. We're finally starting to make money, we can pay our bills.
Yeah, our employees didn't want to sell. Like, it was sad.
We were doing a good thing. And they said, well, let us go through the process and make you an offer. And I'm like, what can that hurt? And we went through the process, and they made an offer, and I said, well, babe, we're going to sell this company. And we did. That was in 2021. And we kind of had to stay as consulting, and we still do some consulting work, or at least I still do some consulting work. I'm still very involved with a handful of cases because I had a pretty significant impact on those cases, so I still have to go to court and testify about my involvement in those cases.
And well, some of those cases you were working on pre-acquisition.
Right.
So.
Well, and COVID really disrupted the criminal justice system, so there's a lot of cases that are backlogged that we're still waiting to get caught up. But once we sold the company, it was time for us to figure out the next step. And we have a pretty strict non-compete, so we're not going to go build another ZX tomorrow. And I got this crazy, wild idea that I think I want to run a brewery.
So he starts buying all this brewery kit. Like there's this pellets of brewery.
Brewha.
Yeah, brewha. And there's these, like, we're getting salt packets being delivered to the house. We have yeast coming. I think you even started
Hops.
taking an online course. Yeah, we had hops,
Yeah.
everything coming to the
Cornell.
house.
I took the brewing class from Cornell.
He took like 2 online classes, which you passed with flying colors.
I did.
But
I'm pretty
then
much a brewer. I've never made beer, though.
he didn't finish the course.
Well, we got busy.
We got busy. So anyhow, because we decided we were going to try to start a brewery, we had to have a brewery name. So because we looked at this mountain that was kind of burned out by our house from a forest fire, we decided we were going to call it Burning Mountain Brewery.
And around the same time, Keri made it pretty clear to me, like, hey, I love you, but I'm not going to run a brewery. And I was like, okay, well, what are you going to do? And her passion is really writing. Keri is actually a very gifted writer.
Thanks,
and I think
Keri.
this is one of the things that are yin and yang, if you will. Like, I etch out stuff in caveman language, like, fire. And then I'll give it to Keri, and you make it beautiful. And we've been very successful in creating products like that. So at the same time, you're kind of looking at, hey, I think I want to write, and I want to write this book, and I really wanted to be supportive. So I got online, and you had talked about these writer retreats, and I found a really cool retreat in Italy, and I'm like, I'm booking this, and I'm flying her to Italy where you can do a writer's retreat, kind of push start that.
Right. So, yes, you're absolutely right. So I do the whole retreat. I start learning a little bit more, not only about some writing processes, but I also started learning the business around writing and started understanding how much publishers actually take from authors when they publish your book. And I remember being on a bus on my way back to Rome from a little town that we were staying in, and I called Cy, and I just kind of pitched this. What did I tell you? I
This
remember.
was like my pitching of ZX to you in reverse, where you're
Yeah.
like, hey, here's the deal. I want to write a book. I'm really motivated to do it, but I'm not going to use a publisher, so we're going to self-publish. So I need you to figure out a business plan for us to build a network big enough somehow that we can self-publish this book and actually have it be successful. Oh, and by the way, true crime is a big deal. It's a big market. You should look
Right.
into this, you said.
So while I was at this retreat, a lot of the women that were in this retreat, amazing women, by the way, and they're all authors, they're in some amazing groups and programs, and they start telling me about the true crime genre. And I didn't know there was a true crime genre.
But at the same time, they're fascinated about your background.
Yeah, they were fascinated about my background, and they asked a lot of questions about, well, do you guys consult? Do you do this? Have you ever considered this or that? And which I never really had at the time, because true crime was just something we did every day. I never looked at it as a form of entertainment, if you will.
Right.
So I didn't know what it was, and I started telling Cy about this, and I said, hey, we need to come up with a business plan around this, because we don't know what else we're going to do, and I don't want to do a brewery. And he agreed.
What could possibly go wrong with a brewery?
He agreed.
So we changed it from Burning Mountain Brewery to Burning Mountain Productions. We were really slow, though. I wasn't convinced that it was the right move for us. And it was funny because we kicked this around for almost 2 years, and we had all these different conversations, and it just didn't quite feel right. And then we went on a trip to Napa about a year ago, and we're in Napa, and this lady at a wine room recognizes me, and she's like, I know who you are. And she named the case that I worked almost 20 years ago, but it's been done on Dateline and 2020
Oxygen.
40 but she knew me, she knew the case, and I was like, babe, that's a sign. Like, she's a true crime junkie.
But you're not a big believer in signs either.
No,
so
I'm
like,
not.
And in the moment, you kind of are.
That's why it took like 20 of them.
So yeah, so then like literally 2.5 weeks later, we are at a gas station, a Circle K.
Different state.
And the cashier recognizes Cy. And pretty much same conversation all over again. So looking to bring our own perspective into the true crime community now.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue. So why Socialite Crime Club? And like I said, I think we really struggled wrapping our heads around, okay, how do we want this to look? We want it to be different. I'm not interested in just making another true crime podcast. Like, there's so many out there. Like, I don't even want to compete with that. So what is it?
Just a needle in a haystack.
Yeah, so what is it that we could do that makes it a little different? Well, we definitely have a little bit of a different twist with the background and the style, I guess, because of our perspectives and how we present that. The second thing is, I want to keep these episodes raw. And what I mean by raw is we're not going to pull a lot of punches to make sure, like, oh, well, we have to be careful. Yes, I said that in the investigation. I would say that to any other investigator I explain this to, but I'm not going to say it on camera because there might be that person that I offend. And I feel like we need to talk about this just a little bit to give our listeners a little bit of background. And there's two things I'll open this conversation with is a good detective has to have the ability to not let his or her investigation get hijacked by emotion. The problem with that is there's two kinds of detectives. Those who have had that happen and those who will have that happen. So over the course of my career, I have allowed my personal emotions to hijack an investigation that was not good for the investigation. And so has any other detective. And if they tell you they never have, they're full of shit. So you have to learn over time, how do you deal with some of the worst things humanity can throw at you and not get hijacked emotionally? And for me and a lot of people in this position, it's humor. We find humor in certain things that some people don't. It's not just law enforcement, nurses.
Yes, doctors, ambulance drivers, first responders, even firefighters. Yeah. When you start seeing the worst of humanity, the worst things that can happen to people on a daily basis, and it's just a normal thing, there's literally a switch that you have to be able to turn on and off in your head, that you pretty much turn off the emotion so that you don't just become drained of who you are as an individual.
Right. And a lot of people will judge you for that later on. You'll be told that, well, you're not being sensitive. And I'm going to push back on that a little bit, I think. At first, I was really worried, like, oh my God, don't put me on camera and have me explain my cases, because I am going to offend somebody. But now I'm looking at this at a much more holistic view, and I'm thinking, hey, if you're going to watch this podcast, you need to understand, I probably have some mental health issues. I know you do. We have some PTSD and some different things that we've experienced. And a lot of times, we cope with that through humor, and it's very natural. I want to stay genuine to the people we are, and when we tell stories, we're going to tell them just like we would our best friend. So maybe don't judge us a little bit for that. Be sensitive to our sensitivities.
Yeah, have some empathy for us.
Yes.
I think the other thing is that what a lot of people don't realize, so we go to CrimeCon, which was an awesome event. We met amazing people. You talked a little bit earlier about...
We will definitely be back next year.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about that tenacity that we talked about the detective on the Little Annie case, right? So when you are working these cases, there is a lot of tenacious characteristics that somebody needs to have to be a great detective. There's a lot of people walking around CrimeCon who are doing so much to try to look at cases, whether they're solving their own loved one's case or they're looking for assistance solving their loved one's case, or they're creators and they are really interested in the potential of solving a case that they've become really interested in.
I have been a cop I've been involved in investigations with law enforcement for almost 30 years. I don't ever think I have seen a bigger group of people so tenacious to just solve stuff than this group. It was insane.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I'm getting at here is that everybody wants to do true crime until it's time to do true crime. And there are things that the person who doesn't actually get to see the blood and guts of everything literally, that might not really understand the necessity of the sympathetic removal that has to come in when you work those cases all the time.
Yeah, and I think that's another perspective that we're going to do our best to bring to this podcast is when we say true crime. Well, true crime is well beyond simply telling a story. It is involvement in the case from the onset, from the 911 call, if there was a 911 call, to the physical investigation, to the follow-up investigation, to preparing it for court, to seeing it through court, your interactions with the victim's family through that whole process, your interactions with a prosecutor, your interactions with defense attorneys. Not very many people talk about the defense side of these cases, and we're going to get into those as well. Mm-hmm. What happens post-conviction?
Well, what it's like for the family during a trial. And the point we really want to drive to our viewers and listeners is, if you want to hear true crime, Socialite Crime Club is our goal to helping you understand what it sounds like.
Absolutely. We're going to give it to you raw. We're going to give it to you just like we would tell our friends. And I get that may not be for everybody, and that's okay. Yeah. But we're still going to tell the story, and it's going to be a fun story to tell.
From our perspective of things.
So, this is our first episode of The Tea Room, and we just wanted to give our audience, our listeners, a little bit of background of, hey, here's where we come from, here's the idea. We're not going to talk about this stuff in our normal episodes because we've got to get right to it. We've got a lot to talk about in those episodes. But please join us in Tea Room to talk about all these other crazy things that are happening behind the scene. We'll always have a good, funny story tied in here somewhere.
Thanks for joining us.
Stay safe.